Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Raymond and your team, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, mostly because it's an opportunity to share and exchange with people who are involved in this kind of business. I would like to talk about some of the challenges of peacekeeping and operations, but mostly I would like to use a case study of the DRC, because I'm more familiar with that, and do some comparisons as we go along. I'd like to thank Ambassador Mies. In 2006, when I was embedded in Congo, he was kind enough to give me a background interview, of which I cannot speak today. So I couldn't even record it. Yeah. But thank you for your work in DRC. So in 2006, I went to Ituri and South Kivu. I'd been a first critic of UN operations in DRC specifically. I actually written an op-ed called UN in Congo, the Failure of a Peacekeeping Mission in the New York Times in 2004. So by the time I got to the field, a lot of the officers were expecting me, apparently. In Bunia, I was embedded with Moroccans. The challenges for them, so Bunia will be, the map is okay. Bunia will be around there. So in Bunia, I was embedded with the Moroccans, and some of the challenge, well, the positive thing for that unit was that the Moroccans have a long history with the DRC. The relationship goes as far as 1960, not only state to state, but people to people. The military trained together. Some of the Congolese officers trained at Moroccan academies. They came in Congo in the 70s to help with another peacekeeping operation, which I think actually provided a different type of model in 77 with General Lubaris. And then the relationship has been continuous. Mobutu is buried in Morocco because of the good relation. So, but what were the challenges with them? The challenge was that they had a serious task to do. If you remember that in 2003, two ethnic groups based in Ituri butchered each other, almost similar to Hutu-Tutsi, the Hemas and the Lendos. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster because the UN was paralyzed. Some of you might have been there, I don't know. The Uruguayan primarily were stationed in Bunia and were just overwhelmed by what was happening. The French then pushed for a resolution to the UN to build what they call Operation Artemis, which was about 1,800 people, mostly French, but also accompanied by, I think, Swedish Special Forces. I think there was some US logistics involved as well. That operation the mandate was very short, but was very effective, because it is that mandate and the mission that led us to the arrest of people like Thomas Lubanga and Gunjolo and others. But I think it was about 3 months, very short, to the point, and they were out. But the results were impressive. Now it's a task of the Moroccans to hold that peace. The challenge, of course, is, one is the equipment, one is the size of the area they have to patrol, and then third is the language. When you don't speak the language, it's always a bit tricky to do the work that you're supposed to do. Even your reconnaissance, as basic as a reconnaissance mission, is difficult, because you cannot even verify often if what you're being told is true. But it was an amazing experience. They're highly respected there. And then I went to the lake, Lake Albert, which used to be called Lake Mobutu. There were Uruguayan naval forces. And that was a different story altogether. Spanish, far more removed from French, and then definitely far more removed from Lingala or Swahili. My time there was kind of interesting because since I spoke the languages, I also dubbed as an interpreter as I went on patrol with all these troops. But I think they were also open enough to me, since they knew that I had a military background. The kind of question I asked, the kind of briefing they did for me was different, I think, from what other journalists will get. What were the challenges there? The mission was actually to monitor and intercept weapon transfers from Uganda to the militias in Congo. They had 3 Zodiac boats, the little dinghies. They had one, a big, about 18-footer. They didn't have any helicopter. They didn't have anything else. So we went on day and night patrols. And I remember being in the middle of the lake, and it kind of dawned on me. I said, this is really stupid of you to come over here. Because if anything happens, there's no help. There is no help. There's no helicopter to come and rescue you. Even if you manage to get your radio communication through, nothing is going to happen. I remember approaching a barge in the middle of the night, and I'm like, if these guys really open fire on us, it's the end. There's nothing. There's literally nothing that can happen. So you can see that even the boldness of the peacekeepers is reduced. You don't want to take missions that you don't have to. Just it doesn't help. From there, I went to Kivu, South Kivu, and was able to sit with the Pakistanis. Actually did an elaborate briefing for me, interviewed General Maqsood, and then went deep into Walungu. This is the territory where the FDR, so we went on many patrol. This is actually when they started this COB that Ambassador Miss was talking about. I was actually part of some of the early things. But there it was also an interesting set of questions, because I will go night and day patrols, and I will ask, where is the FDLR? How come we don't find them? How come you're still having the same problem than you started in 1999? And the response was, you know, we see the FDLR quite often. But when we see them, we radio our Congolese counterpart, and we say, coordinate X, Y, Z, you'll find the FDLR there, take action. And then the Congolese counterpart will say, well, thank you, sir, I'm waiting for instruction from Kinshasa. Right? And of course, the instruction from Kinshasa doesn't seem to come. I met women on the street who remind us why we were there. I remember being in a village called Tubimbi, an area there. Tubimbi used to be the breadbasket of South Kivu, but the market was empty. And you can see the kids suffering from malnutrition. I asked the ladies, the women there, I said, what's the problem? I don't see enough bunga here, enough flour. And the answer was simple. We cannot go to the field. It's high mountain areas. Militia are investing in the field. If we go to the field, they abduct us, they rape us. We cannot maintain our terraces, so the cycle goes on. So what does this, why am I telling these stories? I think the challenge of the peacekeeping mission, if we were to talk about those, are threefold. We have the political side. Often there's a political breakdown. That's why we got there in the first place. There is the humanitarian side, which in parts I've just described. And then there is the security side itself. In the case of the various missions, I think in the case of DRC, then we try to tie it up with maybe Sierra Leone and Mali. In the case of DRC, we know what the political breakdown was about. The problem, of course, was caused by, in part, the Congolese, in part, the Africans, the neighboring countries. So it's good to see a lot of Africans getting involved in finding a solution. But the political problem is actually probably the most important, absent the security sector problem. Because in the case of DRC, if you don't restore the institution, the political institution, if you don't support a clear democratic, successful democratic transition, then we'll always be at -5. We'll never even get to -0 when we can rebuild the country. We saw that through the elections in 2006 and 2011, where the UN played. In 2006, I think they did very well, and the results spoke for themselves. We're able to reestablish a sense of legitimacy for the presidency, in spite of the shortcomings that were there. In 2011, I think it was a disaster. I believe the UN could have played a greater role beyond the logistics. They did a fantastic job on the logistics side, but they were very, at best, coy about getting engaged on the political side. And by that I mean the issues of the vote, the voter list, and all those issues that came to bite us later, and we're back on square -5 because there's a crisis of legitimacy now in DRC, when in fact we were part of that process. So in many ways, we did not do as well on the political side. Humanitarian, it's a big crisis still going on. 2.7 million IDPs. It's hard to explain. Security sector, the heart of our problem, right? And this is where I think you can, if we look at what happened in places like Sierra Leone, you know, things didn't work well with the UN alone. Things start moving when then Prime Minister Tony Blair decided to get involved. The Royal Marines showed up, and then we had a convergence of development that were able to push Sierra Leone forward. Another model probably is what's happening in Mali now. With Operation Serval, one country taking ownership, which is a bit similar to what happened in Sierra Leone. Of course, the order is reversed here, because you have one outside country taking ownership of the issue, pairing up with the local, and clearing the way so that the UN can take place. And hopefully this mission won't take too long. In the case of Liberia, we saw a model that is actually, I think, we should push, which is the regional solution, ECOWAS, which really involvement being the turning point to where, so that people like President Sirleaf, John Santos, people can emerge and put their country on track. If we go back to the DRC, part of the challenge, I think, is that we're doing too many things at once. You know, if you compare the, you know, I brought with me here, this is ONUC. This is the mandate of ONUC. ONUC was the mission from 1960 to 64. Very simple, right? I can read it to you, very, very basic, what they should do. They went there from 60 to 64. The commitment was great. They were out. They didn't own Congolese problems. They didn't try to solve whatever was happening there. They were trying to restore peace and security. They took some killings. But the problem then was actually even much bigger than we have today. Because if you remember, today we're talking about child soldiers, people who know nothing about military tactics. That's what is more baffling. But in 1960, Katanga had an air force, just to give you a sense. You had Jean Scram showing up in Bukavu. You had the Egyptian and Lumumbist up north. So we had serious fighting going on. Today, always, we talk about the militias, I mean the various militias there. But for most of these militias, there's no military tactics training. They can kill you, but they should not be able to stand next to a platoon that's well-trained Kabyles from Guatemala, you know? So then, how did we get to the point where the UN now, I think one question we have to ask, when does a mission, a peacekeeping mission, ceases to be part of the solution and start moving to part of the problem? And I think in the case of DRC, compared to the other cases, we are exactly there, where in '99, MONUC, the creation of MONUC was a breakthrough on so many levels. It's the unification of the country, trying to the discussion with the Lusaka ceasefire accord. African countries who had fought in Congo had come together, tried to solve the problem. It was hopeful. That was in '99. 15 years later, we're still talking about should MONUSCO leave or not leave. So in terms of recommendation, I have about 3 minutes now, so we can have the discussion. I think operations should not be allowed to become mammoth like the UN mission in Congo has become. I think there should be a time limit so that we are there for a specific mission. Because if you look at the trajectory of MONUSCO, every time things really got bad, we had an outside intervention. So in 2003, we had Operation Artemis. In 2004, we let Kunda take over Bukavu. Nothing happened. In 2006, with Kunda and CNDP, we had to bring the German U4 to help the peace in Kinshasa. Now, of course, we're talking about the intervention brigade. So how can we have this mammoth of a force, but when it really matters for protection of civilians, we always have to bring another force? So maybe the model to go, I mean, it's raised some of the questions, as when I was with the Pakistani are hardened fighters, but in Congo, they're very kind of timid. Why do you want to die for another country? It just doesn't make, it's not the model that I think is much more sustainable, especially in the long run. How do you justify as a general the body count that goes home, especially if you've been there for 15 years and people are like, those Congolese cannot fight, or what's the matter? So I think those are some issues that we need to start pondering. Do we want the model like Serval? We want a model like Artemis? Why aren't we involved with SSR? I mean, looking from the ground, it almost looked like this is becoming a business, no longer a Peace Corps operations, so that people are afraid to let go of MONUSCO. So maybe when we design operation, we design them with a timeline, and at this point, after 15 years, we can start saying, the next 5 years, MONUSCO is out. $1.5 billion invested in a country like DRC that needs more money for this kind of insecurity is not justifiable. And then it actually prolongs insecurity, because if the Kinshasa government, you don't have to own up to anything. when things go wrong, if 200 women get raped in Luvungi, the New York Times talk about the peacekeepers who were 20 miles from the village and didn't react. The New York Times does not ask where was the Congolese army to protect these women. So I will end there, and we can take up during the questions. Thank you.